Of course, the government had done all sorts of stupid things. They blew up the big concrete pillars on Bondi Beach. A lot of that had stopped them. And they put tank traps on the way to Palm Beach. But as John said, with 13,000 miles around Australia of beaches and things, they didn't have to come to Bondi Beach if they wanted to land. It was silly. You know, I was 25 and I was living at Balfour Road, Rose Bay. Well, the night of the shelling, we'd just got home from visiting my husband's parents at Mossman. And my husband was very tired. He was working terrific hours at the airbase. So we fell into bed and he went to sleep straight away, but I didn't. And I suddenly heard this woof noise and then whoosh. And I, woof, whoosh. And I said, John, listen, I've never heard the guns make that noise on the golf links. Listen, John. And it was woof, whoosh. And this went on and all of a sudden, woof, whoosh. And then beep, bang. Oh. Well, I took a flying leap from my bed and I don't think I touched the floor in between. And we grabbed the first aid box, we shot down to the air raid shelter, picking up bedclothes on the way because Marge Martin had picked Judith out of the cot, bedclothes and all. She was very frightened. So would I have been if I'd had a little child like that. But we were at the back of the flats, so we didn't take the full blast. The flats in the front took the full blast. And John said, I think we'd better go and see if anyone's been hurt. And he went next door and he found a young couple hiding under the bedclothes, shaking, and the pieces of shrapnel had come through the double brick wall, hit the other walls, hit different things, hit the stove, made a lot of damage. And then I went back out to the air raid shelter and Mrs. Bauer had come down, spread the rug out, and I went to sit down and she said, you can't sit there, Ethel. That's for the mothers and babies. So, anyway, about half an hour after, the air raid siren went off and the air raid wardens started coming around. But when the shelling had all stopped, we all sort of packed ourselves up and went back in and we all were in Marge Martin's flat, drinking coffee and talking. And John nursed the children to sleep. It was, looking back now, you know, there was no real panic or anything.
A funny day. We lived in a suburb called Maroubra, which was beachside. It was in the evening, and I had a stepfather, very much a military man, very patriotic, very much a military man. But, you know, I can't remember if it was the same night, but then there was the bombing of the Navy ship at Garden Island, and the after effects of that. Didn't have anyone involved. I don't know whether I was married then or I was engaged. Anyway, I had a boyfriend in the Navy, and he was away. But my mother had worked in a voluntary capacity at what is now the Prince of Wales Hospital. It was Randwick Hospital then. And she came back and she'd been up there when a lot of the wounded sailors who were wounded on there, and some of them were from New Zealand, and she had spent many years in New Zealand. So she befriended them, and so we girls, our girlfriends, my sister and I, our girlfriends, we used to go over and write letters for the ladies that couldn't write and that sort of thing. And we became very friendly with those New Zealand sailors. So in many ways we were very involved with the war. You know, war to me was my teenage years, the same as it was for so many people.
Japanese ships came to Newcastle in the 1930s. Sailors hired the only cab in town and would take photos of themselves in front of military installations. They also had 1938 British charts that they used to plan their attack. Newcastle had to be protected. Many of Australia's Defence Force already had bases in the area. It was the head of the industries of Australia and home of the BHP Steel Works. Had a deep seaport and harbour, and home to a large coal industry. So a network of artillery, anti-aircraft, searchlights, radar stations and other bases were built for the reason being Newcastle had everything you needed to running a war. Newcastle could produce ammunitions, helmets, rifles, uniforms, dry food for rations packs, a river system to run the barges to move the food around, an already established RAF Air Force base, an estate dockyard which was used for all the vessels that got damaged to be repaired. To protect Newcastle's industries in and around the harbour. The major guns were the four major forts. They had 6-inch or 9-inch guns. Fort Wallace, Fort Scratching, and Park Battery were located in the Newcastle centre. The northern base was Fort Armoury. The northern defence line was at Port Stephens and was the USA base. Australia had a very close alliance with America. The Australian base was called HMAS Assault. Thousands of Australians were trained there, but also thousands of American and English troops were also trained there in landing craft in jungle warfare. The USA Army made an agreement with the Australian government to allow Port Stephens to be taken over by the Americans as an American base. There was a major military operation around the beaches of Port Stephens. They built the road into Nelson's Bay and other infrastructure in the area. An Air Force base was already established at Williamtown. The site had several runways and hangars. This base was used by the RAAF and the USA Air Force for rapid training. They needed to get pilots in the air quickly. The beaches were used for target practice. Thousands of USA planes flew out of here to go north into the Pacific. USA P-40 Warhawks made this their training base. The southern defense line was to defend the RAAF base nearby. RAAF RAF Mines was a Catalina base, which provided final training for crews in the multiple tasks of long-range supply dropping, bombing and mine laying.
We woke up this June winter night in 1942 and hear this, and we all go outside with Dad and Mum. It's about 2:00 and we hear boom boom, and we all thought with Dad that it was our guns practicing. But there was one puzzling thing. The sky was lit up brilliantly. We could see the steelwork.
Newcastle Steelworks at the start of the war in 1939 was the biggest steel plant in the British Empire. Essington Lewis was a great man. Back in 1936, he said, "War clouds are gathering over Europe and we must do something about it now." So ferroalloys we bought from South Africa, and he quickly thought, well, they're in danger. The major item was tungsten carbide, of course. We imported all our tungsten carbide from Germany. Well, he said, get in and make it. And by the end of 1939, our group of qualified people had produced tungsten carbide here and supplied all the ordnance factories in Australia to turn shell casings and gun barrels and everything. Bulletproof steel was made. It was a hell of a thing to make. Some hairy moments making high alloy steels because of the additional temperature you needed. We made thousands of tonnes of shell-grade steel, and we had the shell annex at the works, manned by women, 24 hours a day, on lathes, just turning shell cases. So we're making 300 tonnes a day at one stage, shell steel. Then it was a matter of supplying the right steel to the subsidiaries, like the bulletproof with Lysart plate, Stewart and Lloyd's gun barrels, because they rolled tubes. They had that technology. We were often called on because of the high tonnage required to do something that had never been done in open hearth before. At one stage we made cylinders for the boomerang fighters that we made down there. Well, did we have some trouble with that? We had to go to very high temperatures to melt all these alloys. The roof for the furnace was made of large silica bricks. They got very hot, of course, but at these very high temperatures, they actually melt. Searchlights, star shells, a couple of odd noises which alarmed me a bit, and I thought, this is more than an exercise. So I hair-tailed it back down to the small laboratory on the end of the department. And just as I got there, a phone rang. So I answered the phone. Hello, would you please tell your foreman that we are under attack and to black out all the furnaces? I felt like saying, that's like painting the Harbour Bridge. We didn't get the all clear till 6 a.m. There would have been 70 or 80 blokes down in air raid shelter, most of them having a good sleep.
Yeah, I was one of the pallbearers at the funeral of the 4 Japanese submariners. And they buried them at Eastern Suburbs Crematorium and gave them full naval honour funeral with the hope that by doing so, the Japanese would show a little bit more leniency as far as our prisoners of war which had been taken. Unfortunately, didn't make a bit of difference to them. We all know the story of the atrocities of the Japanese during World War II. The Japanese submarines went into Sydney Harbour, the surprise attack, on Sunday the 31st of May. Those midget submarines were somehow carried on the backs of mother submarines who discharged the midget submarines once they reached outside Sydney Heads. The mother submarine went to work plundering shipping along the east coast of Australia, particularly between Sydney and Newcastle. And only 3 days later, a BHP ship, the Iron Chieftain, was torpedoed. She just left Newcastle with a load of coal bound for Melbourne. The Navy stopped all ships leaving port, and all ships could not sail independently. They had to sail in convoy. So a convoy headquarters was established in Newcastle at HMAS Maitland.
Port of Newcastle. Ships move out to join a convoy as it steams along the coast. Out to sea, a grim hunter waits for its prey.
I was on a ship in the second convoy. We sailed out of Newcastle. There were 14 ships in the convoy. One of the ships, a ship called the Guatemala, was a bit slow leaving port. The Commodore said, I can't afford to stop out here outside Nobby's for fear of being picked off by Japanese submarines. So the 13 ships with the Guatemala, we could see it coming down the Hunter at 1 o'clock the next afternoon when she was just off Door Head. She was torpedoed and sunk. That was my first night at sea. That was a great start. I'd been at sea 4 hours and we'd already lost a ship in the convoy. The submarines operated on the Australian coast for the next 18 months. They'd come and go, and they did quite a bit of damage.
Despite all the efforts of the Navy, losses in ships and men were severe.
It was a very special purpose and a very special routine to operate if you were in trouble, if you were attacked.
Frigates of the RAN, newly built in Australian dockyards, shepherd the convoy. More than 60 corvettes were built in Australia for this purpose.
Iron Crown was travelling with a full load of iron ore bound for Newcastle when off Gabo on the south coast. She was torpedoed and sunk very quickly. Iron ore was a very dangerous cargo, particularly when you're on a ship which is torpedoed, because she went up in a mass of red dust, and when the air cleared, there was nothing left of the ship. 36 of them went down with the ship, 16 survived. Many of the world's largest ships became troop ships during the war. And of course, we've got the story of the Centaur, the hospital ship. It was torpedoed in the middle of the night with a loss of 268 lives, ablaze with light with red crosses marked all over it. And that was sunk by one of the big submarines.
The scene is one of quiet simplicity, the occasion of the cremation of 4 brave men who have died for their country. A country whose policies are viewed with abhorrence by us, but whose brave men in death are honored as all brave men are honored throughout the world. The caskets of the Japanese naval men are being slowly carried between the ranks of the naval party. The firing party has followed the caskets to the cremation chapel. Slowly, slowly and with measured tread, the caskets are now being carried up the aisle of the chapel. Each and all of them still covered by the flag of the rising sun, the symbol which they had died to serve. The caskets having been placed in the cremation chamber, the officer gives the final orders, and the firing party salutes the dead.
Return! Fire! Go!
I have been criticized for having accorded these men military honors. Theirs was a courage which is not the property or the tradition or the heritage of any one nation. It is the courage shared by the brave men of our own countries as well as of the enemy. And however horrible war and its results may be, it is a courage which is recognized and universally admired. These men were patriots of the highest order. How many of us are really prepared to make 1,000th of the sacrifice that these men have made?